All right, we are on we're just going to finish up these notes. We got through page 378, so be sure you get out your notes. 378, we talked about energy flow through an ecosystem. Energy flow, remember it's not energy cycle because it can't be recycled. There has to be a constant input of energy from the sun. We're going to switch gears now and we're going to talk about the biogeochemical cycle, which is the cycle. Now, this is an actual cycle, not a flow, because nutrients can be recycled. So the biogeochemical cycles are the nutrient cycles that contain both biotic and abiotic components. And we're going to focus on 4 different cycles: water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And you don't have to write that down, but just wanted to let you know on 380 and 381, those are the cycles that we're going to talk about. So the biogeochemical cycle is going to contribute to the back and forth between organic to inorganic compounds. So for an example, glucose would be considered organic, right? Proteins would be considered organic. When they get broken down by an organism and digested, and then let's say the cellular respiration, how glucose gets broken down, it releases carbon dioxide. So there's a back and forth between organic and inorganic compounds depending on how they're bonded and what atoms they're bonded to. But glucose being consumed and then the carbon and oxygen being released as carbon dioxide, if you really think about what happens to that carbon dioxide, it gets taken by plants, turned back into glucose. So that's what that back and forth means right there. Nutrient cycles, like I said, water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus are the nutrients that we're going to discuss. This picture right here on page 379 is just showing you how organic materials, depending on where they are in a cycle, can be available or unavailable. So if we just start in the top left, organic materials available as nutrients, and you have living organisms and or detritus. Those things get fossilized, and when they get fossilized, they are then compressed down into the earth, and now they're unavailable as nutrients. Compressed fossils or really just any kind of buried combustible geologic deposit of organic material is going to form fossil fuel. All right. When we tap into this area down here, like peat, coal, and oil, and we burn it, it then makes that carbon source available now. And so now I'm on this picture right here. All right, and then there's a few more. So let's say burning of fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide. Well, carbon dioxide can then be used as photosynthesis for this plant. And then, but then remember, the plant is also going to release more carbon dioxide when it does cellular respiration, just like this deer right here also releases carbon dioxide when it does cellular respiration. So this is showing you right here carbon dioxide available. Then we have the formation of sedimentary rock. And so we're not necessarily talking about a carbon source anymore, but this is how phosphorus becomes available. So if you have phosphorus being packed into rocks or other minerals being packed into rocks, it's weathering and erosion that then makes it available again. So this is just showing you how minerals get cycled through an ecosystem and turn into forms that are available and then turn into forms that are unavailable. All right, so our first cycle is the water cycle. It is the easiest cycle. And I just want to make sure that I acknowledge, when we talk about this and we talk about the other mineral cycles, the reason we're talking about them is these are things that are monitored by environmental scientists that can give them an idea of the health of an ecosystem. So just like we talked about, they're going to measure the amount of carbon dioxide being taken in and the amount of oxygen being released to see what the primary productivity is in certain ecosystems. They're also going to monitor the cycles of minerals. The water cycle is considered a biogeochemical cycle. It's essential, obviously, to all organisms. and its availability influences the rates of ecosystem processes. So the more water there is, the more green plants are going to be able to grow, and so those processes are going to happen really fast. And so we just have here the movement of water, and this is stuff that you guys learned probably in elementary, lower school. We know how water moves. It precipitates, it moves and it runs off as groundwater. It evaporates and then it turns into precipitation again. So that's pretty easy. I think at this point, especially in this class, we know how important water is to biological processes. But I'll just leave you with the oceans contain 97% of the water in the biosphere. 2% is bound in glaciers and polar ice caps, and then 1% is found in lakes, rivers, and groundwater, with a negligible amount in the atmosphere. So the most is in the ocean, which I'm sure you already knew. All right, carbon cycle. So the biological importance of carbon is that it's the framework of organic molecules that are essential to all organisms, like the formation of glucose. Photosynthetic organisms are going to use carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, and they're going to convert the carbon to organic forms like glucose that are used by consumers. The major reservoir for carbon is going to be found in fossil fuels, soil, sediments in aquatic ecosystems and oceans. It's also going to be found in plant and animal biomass, and then in the atmosphere. So those are all the different places you can find carbon dioxide. All right, so I'll repeat that again in case you wanted to jot some of them down. So the reservoirs for carbon are going to be found in fossil fuels, soil down here, the sediment of aquatic ecosystems, so that would be down here. The oceans, they have dissolved carbon compounds. Plant and animal biomass, that has an infrastructure that's made out of carbon. Rocks like limestone. And then the atmosphere. All right. See if I had any other text on there. And so the carbon cycle is probably at this point in time the most important one to talk about. And if we were in class, I would ask you why. Why is the carbon cycle the most important one, the hottest topic right now? And that is because all living things, animals, plants, are going to return carbon dioxide to the atmosphere through cellular respiration. But what's really causing a significant amount of additional carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is the burning of fossil fuel in wood. Over time, volcanoes can add a substantial source of carbon dioxide, but it's the burning of fossil fuels that's really adding the most. And why is this important? Because carbon dioxide is going to absorb infrared heat, and that is going to contribute to global warming. Or rather, they're going to absorb the energy from infrared radiation from the sun, but what that does is it causes the carbon dioxide molecules to vibrate, and it essentially gives off heat. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, when you have more of it and it absorbs the infrared radiation, it's going to make things basically hotter. One thing leads to another and it makes things hotter. And if things get hotter, you see glaciers melting, areas where, animals or plants were able to survive, well, now they're at a temperature where their proteins are misfolded or something like that, and so they're not able to survive. So that's why that's an issue, and that's why we talk a lot about just in everyday society, like how can we reduce this? Well, the first thing is would be to reduce the burning of fossil fuels. Right, the third cycle is the nitrogen cycle. This one's my favorite. I don't know why. I just really love the nitrogen cycle because I like nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen fixation is kind of like a symbiotic relationship between nitrogen fixing bacteria in the soil and plants. So remember, I thought we had talked about this before, but maybe not. We're going to talk about it now. Remember that bacteria that lives in soil is going to capture nitrogen from the atmosphere. So nitrogen from the atmosphere that's a form that plants can't use. So bacteria are going to do a process called nitrogen fixation. That was in our bacteria chapter. That's right. So if you look back at our bacteria chapter, it has an actual diagram of this. I remember that. So they're going to fix it into a form that plants can use and then provide nitrogen to plants. So that's pretty cool. And that's happening down here in the soil. And what the bacteria is doing is it's turning this nitrogen into ammonium, nitrite, and nitrate, and that gets absorbed by plants. So bacteria capturing nitrogen from the atmosphere is called nitrogen fixation. And then plants being able to use what's made from nitrogen fixation is called nitrification. But I just kind of lump it all together with being nitrogen fixation, because the plants are just going to use it anyways. The main reservoirs for nitrogen is the atmosphere. Yeah. So just in the air around us that has all the nitrogen in it, most of it, that's 80%. Other reservoirs can be inorganic or organic nitrogen compounds that are in the soil. Maybe there's amino acids, maybe there's other nitrates and ammonium sitting around. And you're going to find them in sediment of lakes and rivers and oceans. They're going to find nitrogen at the surface of water and groundwater. And you're going to find a certain amount of nitrogen that is part of the biomass of living things. One thing here that I want you to notice, what is important about the nitrogen cycle from an ecological standpoint. Look at this word right here where my cursor is, fertilizers. Fertilizers are great. Fertilizers kind of bypass this bacteria nitrogen fixation and provides the ammonium, nitrate, and nitrites for plants just straight away. Problem is when the fertilizer runs off into bodies of water. What that causes is called eutrophication. That causes an overgrowth of algae on the top of the water, which prevents sunlight from being able to get through, which can kill off other photosynthetic organisms. So fertilizer running off into bodies of water isn't a very good thing. So I think there's restrictions in agriculture on how much fertilizer can be used. So something an environmentalist would do is maybe I would call it like an audit, I guess, of like agricultural sites to see exactly how much nitrogen there is, how much is getting run off into bodies of water nearby, and if that's causing a problem with an overgrowth of algae, or algal blooms is what it's called. So that's what makes the nitrogen cycle important. Denitrification is when nitrogen is released into the atmosphere. And what that means is their bacteria is doing the opposite of nitrogen fixation. They're taking nitrites and nitrates, using the oxygen and releasing the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. Right, the phosphorus cycle. And so the biological importance of phosphorus is that it is needed to make nucleic acids. So like DNA and RNA has a phosphorus, remember. Phospholipids has a phosphorus, and ATP has a phosphorus. It is available through sedimentary rocks, marine sedimentary rocks is really where you're going to find the largest accumulation of phosphorus. There's also large quantities of phosphorus in the soil, in the oceans, and just in living things in general. And because the soil particles bind phosphate, the recycling of phosphorus tends to be really quite localized in the ecosystem. So what you can see here in this picture, what that means is that the direct weathering of rocks is going to gradually add phosphate to the soil. Some leaches into water. You can see that here. Phosphate is then taken up by producers and incorporated into biological molecules that may be eaten by consumers. Phosphate is then returned to the soil or water either by the decomposition of biomass or the excretion by consumers. So there's no significant phosphorus-containing gases. Only small amounts of phosphorus can move through the atmosphere, usually in the form of dust or sea spray. So really what it says, when phosphorus reservoirs are like local, that means they're not like floating around the atmosphere. It's part of rock, and then the rock gets weathered and it runs off, gets taken up by aquatic organisms. gets eaten by other organisms and then returned back to the ground through waste excretion, basically. So yeah, phosphorus is important. I can't think of any like real like environmental impacts that humans are having on the phosphorus cycle like I can with the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle. So just so you know what it is and where it's found and that it's very important. Who knew rocks were so important, right? And so that's the overview of the 4 biogeochemical cycles that environmental scientists study. We weren't really able to do a lot of labs on this. You know, I chose our major our lab work to be the beekeeping, and this all plays a part into that. You can always relate any of this to bees and the health of a hive and the health of plants and the health of an ecosystem that a bee needs to work in. So we can always relate it back to that. But I'm just doing kind of a broad overview of environmental science just in general. So I have 2 slides left. I just wanted to close out this unit talking a little bit about bioremediation and bioaugmentation. So when an environmental scientist is monitoring an area and they do find there are issues, what are some things that can be done? And so bioremediation is the use of organisms to detoxify polluted ecosystems. And so what you see in these images, it's a gravel and clay mine site in New Jersey before and after restoration. And so what can be done is plants and lichens can be introduced into the area and they can adapt to soils that contain heavy metals. And what they do is they basically like suck the heavy metals up. And so restoration ecologists can introduce species like these plants and these lichens to sites that are polluted by mining, which happened over here on the left side, and other human activities. And then what they can do is harvest these organisms to remove the metals from the ecosystem. So you can find plants that will actually remove the metals from an ecosystem, which is super cool, I think. Bioaugmentation is when environmentalists or environmental scientists will introduce desirable species to add essential nutrients. So they'll add nitrogen fixers into an ecosystem. And so the difference between bioremediation and bioaugmentation is that bioremediation is you're using an organism to remove something from that ecosystem. Bioaugmentation, you're using an organism to add something to that system. So let's say you have a type of plant or you have a type of microorganism that's really good at nitrogen fixing, and you have an ecosystem that needs a boost in nitrogen fixation so other plants can grow. You can add that to that ecosystem so that you can get a boost in primary production, basically. And so if you need to pause and write that down. Lastly, we have bioremediation of groundwater contaminated with uranium. So an organism, a microorganism was introduced, and the microorganism actually absorbed all of the uranium. So certain prokaryotes can do that. Last thing is restoration ecology projects. And there's a broad range of the types of projects that are currently being done. For example, I'm just thinking of an example off the top of my head, like if a hurricane came in and destroyed like a wetland or destroyed a river, what environmental scientists would do is they would come and try to restore that river, meaning they're going to repair waterways that are no longer able to perform functions like mitigating floods, providing clean drinking water, removing excessive level of nutrients and sediments, and is unable to support like fish and wildlife. So that can be done. Other things could be like revegetating like land that has been overgrazed by livestock. And this one's really cool. I just got my diving certification a few months ago for the Hawaii trip this summer, but I hear of scuba divers going and planting, what are they called? They're called like nursery grounds, And so what they're doing is they're constructing like a seafloor habitat, and they're transplanting seaweed and seagrass like from natural beds and just making like these things called nursery grounds, so which are really important for fish and shellfish to be able to survive. So that's just another example of restoration ecology project. All right, that's actually all I have for this chapter, and that was the last chapter. At this point, we'll go ahead and do a quiz on it. I'll open for questions next time I see you, but obviously before you take your quiz, it's open notes. It's going to be kind of like the last one. I'm going to try to make it as like College Board questions as possible. But let me know if you had any questions over this, and I will see you guys later.